There are no rules or paradigms in the classic or traditional sense. And so I'm going to underscore that to speak to your question again. In the classic or traditional sense, there just are no rules, certainly not the kind that we teach or talk about. Now the question becomes, if this is what's in your head, how does it get there? Any takers on this? Okay, well let's go back to one of our points. Practice isn't what it's cracked up to be. Now I want to ask you, this is Ardens Participation here, so tell me if this looks familiar to you. This is from a 2010 first edition, so published 3 years ago, college level text in French. And the activity that teachers are supposed to do with students, and maybe some of you do this in your classes, looks like this. Restate the question using inversion. So now this is back to yes-no questions, right, in French. So you have, est-ce que vous parlez espagnol? And then what you do as the learner or the student in class is do what? You say, parlez-vous espagnol, right? And then, est-ce qu'il étudie à Paris? And then what you say as a student is what? Étudie, you have to put a little t in there. Étudie-t-il à Paris, right? Est-ce qu'il voyage avec des amis? And you would say what? Voyage-t-il avec des amis? So you're just inverting the subject. And est-ce que tu aimes les cours de langue? And you would say, aimes-tu les cours de langue? Okay, so you're basically just inverting the main subject and the verb. Okay, now, we know this, well, we won't get into what this actually doesn't do. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but if you insert nonsense words in here, you can tell that this probably doesn't do much. So insert some nonsense words and you can still do the activity. Okay, but my question here is, what does putting this activity and asking teachers to do this, and teachers actually doing it, suggest about language learning for teachers and students? What does it suggest to them? How do you get language in your heads? By doing what? By practicing these form-related things, and largely devoid of meaning. As I said, you could put, est-ce que vous tangez espagnol? And I don't know what the hell tangez means, but I can say, tangez-vous espagnol? And the teacher would go, very good, right? So, what the suggestion here is that by practicing these things, it's how you get language in your head. Now, after 4 decades of second language research, what has become crystal clear to all of us in the field is that language in the mind-brain is not built up but from practice, such as the kind we just demonstrated, but from what? Ooh, this guy's good. But you don't get rules from input, okay? Consistent and constant exposure to input. Okay, now what's input? Those of you who you took that class with me, didn't you? Okay, so what's input? Well, we have a definition. Input is language that learners hear or read in some communicative context. It is language that learners respond to for its meaning, not for its form or its structure. So that activity before can't be input because 1, learners are doing this rather than listening or reading, and 2, learners are not responding to anything for its meaning, they're responding to it for its form. So input can only be language in some kind of communicative context. And by communicative, we mean the learner has to be responding to that language he or she is exposed to for what it's saying, not how it's saying it. Okay? Yes. And they have to be, in the sense of their response is, yes, I understand. Their response is to comprehend it, not to sit there. Okay, because the mistake, we'll see later, but the mistake that a lot of teachers make is they think that you can just talk a lot at students. No. Students have to be engaged with the input. They can't just be sitting there like, they're not little sponges. Okay, and even sponges are very active critters, by the way. Okay, now, input is indispensable in language acquisition. There are no shortcuts. There's just no way to say this other than no shortcuts. So practice cannot be a substitute for exposure to input. It just cannot. If the mental representation in your head builds up only through input, you can't say, oh, well, I'll make a shortcut and make them practice it. All you're doing is spending time practicing, but they're not getting input. Okay? Now, does the indispensability, is that the right way to say that? Does the need for input mean that input guarantees acquisition? No, it doesn't. Nothing guarantees acquisition, okay? In fact, non-nativeness is the norm in second language acquisition. It's not the exception, it's the norm. Almost everyone who's a second language speaker is on some scale of non-nativeness. That's just the way it is. What the need for input, note to self, change that slide. What the need for input means is that real acquisition does not happen in its absence. That's what it means, okay? So that traditional practice may result in language-like behavior, but not acquisition. There's a difference between language-like behavior and actual acquisition going on in your head, okay? I see some of you nodding, so this is probably familiar to you. Okay, now keep in mind here we're referring to acquisition of mental representation, the stuff in your head, okay, which is essential for acquisition. We're not talking about your ability to use language. We're going to get to that in a minute. But for language to happen in your head, you've got to have input. So now, almost every aspect of language, in fact, we could argue every aspect of language is acquired through interaction with input. Syntax, which is sentence structure, the constraints on sentence structure. Phonology, the constraints on the sound system. Morphology, the constraints on the shapes of words. For example, reslept versus resurface. Lexicon, okay. Pragmatics. Everyone know what pragmatics means? That's speaker intent. We'll see pragmatics in a minute, example of pragmatics in a minute, and so on. Anything that's related to language is ultimately acquired through interaction with the language. Okay. Are there any exceptions? I can't think of any, and I don't know anybody who would actually, in the field of linguistics or language acquisition, would actually argue this. So we're going to say right now, just if not everything, almost everything is acquired through input. Now, with that said, there is one exception for sure to stuff that is not acquired through input. Can you even guess what those are or what that is? Those aspects of language that are universal and built in prior to exposure, and we all have this. These are universal constraints and features on language that all languages must obey. They just have to. Sentences have underlying our hierarchical structure like we saw in that tree, right? And these consist of phrases, as we said, verb phrases, noun phrases, and then in the functional part, tense phrases, complementizer phrases, and so on. These phrases in turn have a head and a complement. So in a noun phrase, the noun would be the head, and what it's associated with is its complement. So professor, head of linguistics is the complement. That makes a noun phrase, for example, okay? Verb phrase would be, the verb is the head and there'd be a complement. So teaches, linguistics. So teaches is the head, linguistics is the complement. And then in a prepositional phrase, the preposition would be the head and then there'd be a complement. So it would be at is the head and MSU is the complement. So what you have in this one sentence, Bill is a professor of linguistics who teaches linguistics at MSU. You have a series of phrases that together are in some hierarchical order that make up the sentence. And within all these phrases is this other universal constraint, which is all phrases must have a head. If you don't have a head, you don't have a phrase. Okay. Now, phrases also have complements. Whether the complements have an overt manifestation or not is another story. Okay. But it's built in there in the universality of languages that all languages have this underlying hidden structure. Okay, now what does that mean? That learners don't need input to know that language is hierarchical and consists of phrases. They come to your class, they come as children, they come at any stage in life knowing this already. I put knowing in quotes. It's implicit knowledge, okay? It's built in. It comes automatically because this information is part of what we call the universal properties of language or universal grammar. I work in a field of linguistics that believes in something called universal grammar. Other people will talk about it differently if they're in a different kind of paradigm, but for now we'll say universal grammar. So these universal things come in, and you don't need exposure to input, you got them automatically. So before you even get exposed to Japanese, before you even get exposed to Swahili, before you get exposed to French, you know that languages have hidden structure, and part of the hidden structure are phrases, and there must be heads in phrases. And your brain will automatically make use of that information as it starts to build the language structure over time. Nobody needs to teach you that. But learners do need input to know which of the two variations for languages corresponds to the language they are learning. Okay, and here comes some interesting stuff in a minute. The example is English, which is head initial, and Japanese, which is head final. So we're going to look at some little trees again, real simple ones. So on this side we have English, on that side we have Japanese. So English is what we call strictly head initial. So all heads, for example, nouns and verbs and prepositions, so on, come before the complement. Japanese is strictly head final. What that means is that prepositions, nouns, everything else come after the complement. So in English you would say, Taro eats apples in the kitchen. In Japanese we would say, Taro apples eats. And then for the prepositional phrase we would say, the kitchen, well they don't have the in Japanese, so it would be kitchen in. So what you would actually say in Japanese is, Taro, kitchen in, apple eats. That's what you actually say in Japanese. Japanese is strictly head final. And that pervades the entire system, even the functional system. So when you go to make a sentence where you make a yes-no question, I always come back to yes-no questions because they're easy to work with. English has to take the do, remember it moves up to the C part, and that C part is the head of the CP, of the complementizer phrase. So you have does, and the complementizer is the rest of the sentence. John eats apples. Japanese, it's reverse. You have John apple eats, and the ka that makes it a yes-no question comes afterwards because the sentence is the complement of the C. So it's exactly mirror opposite. You embed in Japanese. English we embed with that. Japanese embeds with to, for example. And you get, again, the same thing. So you get John said that. The that is in the C in English. And the complement of that is Taro eats apples. In Japanese, the complement of to is Taro eats apples. But the way we say it in Japanese is John, Taro apples eats to, said. So Japanese always has that stuff coming after it. English always has the head coming first. These are called parametric variations of language and are based on input data. So you have to get input data to know what your language is going to do. But note that learners do not need exposure to all of the input to set a new parameter. That is, we just saw basic sentences, which just verbs and prepositions. Then we saw sentences where you're making yes-no questions, and now all of a sudden you have a CP with a does and a ka. And then we saw sentences where you have embedded clauses and you have a that and a to, right? So we're getting more complex with functional stuff. I, as a learner of Japanese, don't need to hear a sentence with to or ka to know where ka and to are going to go, as long as I've had exposure to basic sentences. The minute I get exposure to basic sentences in Japanese, my head goes, boom, Japanese is head final, and I don't have to be taught anything more about word order. In fact, I don't have to be taught anything about word order. We did this study, actually, what I just described. We had learners we took through Japanese, and after just 100 sentences of subject, object, verb, they demonstrated sensitivity to violations of word order they hadn't been exposed to. So they got sentences like the red one. They didn't get red and black. They just got black. They got no clue what was right and what was wrong. But when they got sentences like the red one, they slowed down on reading those sentences as opposed to the grammatical ones. Okay. When they read the embedded clauses, they slowed down on the ones that were ungrammatical. So even though they had not had any exposure to to or ka, when they got to those sentences, they slowed down on the ungrammatical ones while they were reading, showing us that they were already building up a system that said Japanese is head final. Nobody ever told them. Okay, they were able to project beyond SOV and go, all of Japanese is head final. Okay, so parametric variations can happen. You don't have to be exposed to everything. You just get exposure to one particular thing and boom, the language goes, it works this way. Or your head goes, the language works this way. So they reset the phrase word order and parameter even though they hadn't been exposed to basic sentences in Japanese in our study. Now, my friend Jason Rothman and I summarize what acquisition is all about in a nutshell this way. And I'll give you this reference later. Learners do not acquire rules from the input. Okay? Instead, learners process what we call surface morphophonological units. That is, words, lexical form, and morphological form. Okay? They process these things in the input and internalize these units along with underlying features or specifications. Now, that doesn't mean they get the features and specifications right away. Sometimes it might take a while for them to get that to build up over time what those features and specifications are, which is why acquisition takes so long. But that's what they've got to do with words and morphological form. Now, these units interact in the head with information provided by universal grammar and the language-making mechanisms of the human language faculty. That is, whatever's in your language that's responsible, whatever's in your head that's responsible for language works on these data from the input, such that anything that resembles rules from our outside perspective evolves over time. It's not what you acquire, it's what you wind up with in the end. So what you get over time is these bits and pieces of language that reassemble themselves in your mind over time until you get to a point where you have stuff in your head that looks like the second language. So these learners of Japanese are not processing word order as a rule, they're processing taro, apple, eats, this and that. And underlying their grammar is doing stuff to that information that they're processing, those little pieces and parts of language that they're processing. Hope that clarified that for you, what I was talking about with rules. Okay, so what else do we know about input and development of mental representation? Well, some aspects of the representation are triggered relatively soon, like the Japanese word order stuff. Same would be true if you're Japanese learning English. Word order would be triggered very, very quickly. Some take longer. Some aspects of language just take longer because just for whatever reasons. Stuff like lexicon, words and everything they contain, morphology, which is also part of the lexicon, often take a long time. We've got plenty of data in this. I can tell you about a study later if you want. That's very surprising. It would make your jaw drop. Okay, and that there is stage development over time. And I have an example of that to show you in a minute. So the question we have now is, if input is so important, what does traditional practice do? What does that change the following sentences to inversion? Est-ce que vous parlez français? Parlez-vous français? What does that kind of practice do? And your answer is what? Essentially, not much. Very little, if anything. In fact, there are some people who argue much more strongly than I that say it does nothing, right? It does not help with mental representation. It is not clear that it helps with skill development, which we're going to touch on